So, Xianyun has been out for basically a week by now, and a hefty amount of testing has been done by various people, whether it be players such as other content creators and myself included. What do I think about her? How is her performance in relative to the meta or like the gameplay factor? Personally, I think she's great. She's very much meta defining. However, given how semi-niche she is, her strength is definitely situational depending on how you want to play her. So, Xianyun's main role is to basically enable plunging attacks with her burst, as it allows your active character to jump really high within a period of 16 seconds. Her Ascension 1 buffs plunging attack crit rate based on how many enemies Xianyun hits with her elemental skill. Her Ascension 4 is the bread and butter that gives the extra damage buff. Essentially, it buffs plunging attack based on Xianyun's overall attack stat. This works very similar to how Shenhe's Quills and Yunjin's elemental burst works, where a flat damage bonus is added to or any sort of attack, any sort of damaging ability right before crit itself. However, keep in mind that this buff is not infinite. It does not last forever, as the Ascension is based on how many stacks your burst has, and the burst is limited to only 8 stacks, which each stack is consumed every time your active character does a successful plunging attack. I personally have tested a lot of different teams for my own account. Some of the examples would include the likes of Dragonstrike Diluc, or Tao Plunge Vape, Xiao Hyper, Mono and Emo, and Jiaming Hyper, or Gaoming Hyper as you guys like to call it. And I can easily say that all of them are good in their own way. And since I'm one of the few people that have C6 there Bennett, I also had the chance to try a lot of unconventional teams that you wouldn't usually run normally. Some examples would include the Xinyan Plunge Vape, Shenhe Melt Plunge team, Noelle Plunge, Faruzan Li, and even the weirdest one I had done by far is Cyno Plunge. So let me quickly go over what I have found for each individual team. So first of all, we have Diluc Dragonstrike, and let's be honest, the performance is good as expected, because ever since the community discovered the concept of Dragon Striking, which for those who don't know, Dragon Strike is the term coined for Diluc's ability to do plunging attacks in certain situations, and the reason why this is so good is because Diluc has a very high plunging attack multiplier for his auto attack talent. Before Xianyun, it is quite hard to perform Dragon Strike since it requires a lot of skill, and it's quite dependent on what kind of enemies you go against, and basically it's a very skill based thing, and now it's become much easier as you basically have Xianyun to give you the ability to jump super high. I personally tested this with the likes of Furina Xianyun in a vape team, where Xianyun's using the 4-piece Viridescent Veneer effect, and I could easily see over 100k vape plunges, and the damage and the smoothness is actually, it feels pretty good to play. It is definitely a little bit annoying to try to set up like a swirl setup, but it's definitely workable. But you can also just opt to not run for Viridescent or just skip the whole process of trying to swirl. And if you don't have C6 Bennett, I think Diluc Dragonstrike team is quite annoying to perform, because C6 Bennett does provide a pyro infusion for melee characters and a pyro damage bonus, but without C6 you have to absolutely use his burst in order to gain the pyro infusion from Diluc's ability, because otherwise you're not going to be able to get that pyro infusion. Does trigger Vape's home plunging attacks. The downside of this team is that his skill and burst is not as useful, given that this team has Furina, and Furina's hydro application is not exactly the strongest among all hydro characters. However, you can swap out Furina for Xingqiu if you want a bit more hydro application, like maybe sometimes after you do a single plunge, you can weave a normal attack into a plunge to apply hydro, just so Diluc is able to trigger the vape. Now for the next team, we have the Tao Plunge team. From my testing, it's not really that much different than the regular charge attack playstyle that's been around ever since her release, but I would say it's fun in its own way, and it has its own fair share of benefits. One of the few things is that Tao is very much a single target DPS, as she can, your charge attack, you can only really hit one person, and in order for you to hit multiple enemies, those enemies have to be right next to each other, and you have to basically charge attack in a way that you can somehow hit both of them at once. With Xianyun, Tao is able to take advantage of her above average plunge attack scaling from her, her regular normal attack talent, and you are able to have some form of AoE if you're going against like a multi-wave content or enemies, or more than just one enemy, so not a single target situation. And for this case, I would say Tao is actually quite decent in this case. And even though I personally don't think it's worth to get Xianyun to try out this team, I can definitely say I've been having a lot of fun, and I've been having much more fun than I expected to be with this team. For the next team, we have the good old plunging attack boy, Lament Man, the Xiao Hyper team. So one of the things I would like to point out about this team is that Xianyun, from my experience, has been a much more pleasant experience and could possibly be better than using Bennett in this team. Now here's a few reasons. Number one is that you're not tied to Circle Impact, and Circle Impact refers to abilities of certain characters where they are put in place and they're not mobile. mobile. Like Bennett's burst puts a field down, or Zarya puts like a field of lance that does occasional cryo damage. That's what you call circle impact, because the abilities doesn't actually follow you like Chaos Burst or Xiangling's Burst. And generally, a majority of the community, at least in myself included, I personally don't really like this kind of playstyle. I don't really like circle impact because it restricts your battlefield and you can't really leave it, because otherwise your ability is basically useless. The second reason is that because Xianyun is an emo, right, and you're going to be running this team with like Faruzan and Furina, so you have 3 anemo units, and by having another anemo unit, it actually helps quite a lot with the energy requirement for both Faruzan, Xianyun, and of course Xiao himself. And another reason is that in order to run Furina in a Xiao team, you need to somehow find a way to heal your characters a lot to build Furina's fanfare stacks, thus increasing the all damage percent buff from her burst. Xianyun's burst, the initial animation, does actually do like an initial cast of healing that heals the entire team, which occasionally heals a character every 2.5 seconds, while Bennett exclusively only heals the active character, and his healing only works in the premise that your character is below 70% HP threshold, so it's quite hard to build a stack unless you put your Bennett on some sort of like full maiden healer build. On the other hand, Xianyun has the ability to heal your characters to full and beyond full, and if you have Furina, right, if you trigger a healing overflow and Furina is not the one triggering this, you can trigger her Ascension 1 where she basically heals the entire team based on a certain portion of her HP, which it's pretty nice. It allows you to build more fanfare stacks and keeps your team topped up in a pretty safe manner. The downside is that Xianyun's buff from her Ascension 4 only applies to one target, which works differently from Shenhe and Yunjin, because Shenhe and Yunjin, right, the quota mechanic that they have is based on per hit per enemy, while Xianyun's A4 buff only applies to a single enemy. So even if you were to plunge like say 2 to 3 enemies, only one of those enemies will receive the benefits of Xianyun's buff, while the others will probably do like much lower damage. So I've done a bit of testing. It is quite interesting to see why it works like this. I don't actually get why it does work like that, but just keep this in mind if you do have Xianyun and you do intend to use her. From my rounds of testing that I've conducted, Xianyun's Ascension 4 buff provides more damage than Bennett's attack buff from his burst. Like I could see my Xiao easily hit like 100k plunge to like I think 115, 120k was my highest, while with Bennett I could only see up to maybe 85 to 90k. If I'm being generous, maybe 95k. So I would say in certain situations, Xianyun is definitely much better than Bennett, and it feels way more comfier to play. Anyway, speaking of anemo carries, I tested something really interesting. Basically, Xianyun Plunge. Surprisingly a decent team. Granted, the footage that you're going to be seeing in the background right now has a level 5 talent for her auto attack, and because I have C6 Faruzan, the damage was actually quite decent. You could see like a 60k to 70k plunge. The skill, if you tap it 3 times, could do like 100k, and surprisingly, because there's Furina and Bennett and like my Xianyun's running like a DPS build, she is able to clear this chamber quite comfortably. Not the most comfortable, but definitely decent. I feel like a super invested Xianyun with, let's say, her best in stock weapon with a leveled up normal attack should be able to do quite comparable damage to even the likes of Hyper-Carry Xiao. Now for the next team, we have Gaming Hyper. So my Gaming is personally at C1. I took a day to like build him, and I've tested him in the likes of, say, the Xianyun Furina teams, whether it be the regular Vape teams, and even the likes of the Melt team. I would say the damage is pretty decent at C0, and I imagine it'd be stronger at C6 because C6 basically gives like crit rate and crit damage buff to his elemental skill. Like for my gameplay, I could easily see like 70k to 150k vapes for whether it be the Melt or the Vape team. I would say the only downside is that if you don't have C6 Bennett, you can't really weave in any additional plunges. Well, it's a little bit weird to play with Gaming because, as you guys might know, his skill allows him to like plunge if he collides into an enemy, and when he has his burst, he summons a little lion thing, and the lion comes back, it'll basically reset the skill. It doesn't actually happen fast enough for you to really do a lot of damage, so playing Gaming in his plunge teams does get a little bit awkward at times. The damage is pretty decent, but if you don't have C6 Bennett, it's gonna be a little bit awkward to just kind of stand there and basically do nothing. If you have C6 Bennett, you can allow Gaming to do like a regular normal punching attack with his claymore, and with the pyro infusion, it's able to trigger vape. The damage is quite decent. In fact, I feel like Gaming is one of the few characters that can convince some people out there to finally C6 their Bennett. I also tried some weird unconventional teams like I mentioned just now. Like for now, we'll talk about Xinyan Plunge. Xinyan Plunge is surprisingly decent if you were to build her as a pyro DPS. As you can see in the footage, I think she could hit about 100k something vape, and honestly, like if any character has a very good scaling, I'm sure all of them would have a similar performance. And it's crazy how like Xinyan can actually turn so much underwhelming or just not that great units into a decent DPS, and Xinyan is one of those units that benefit pretty well from it. Another team that I did try is Shenhe Plunge, but with Melt. However, I find that this team is rather tricky for a few reasons. Number one is that you need Chongyun's elemental skill for the Cryo Infusion, and since you do want the Pyro application to be often, you need someone like Shengling because their burst has like no ICD, so you can apply Pyro most of the time. And another issue I found is that this team has Shenyun, Bennett, and Chongyun. It's a very energy hungry team. It's definitely not her most optimal team, but I could see quite a decent amount of damage, so it definitely works. The downside is that a lot of other Polam characters are not really Xiao, so you do have to make an effort to do dash cancels or whatnot, or do like an N1 cancel for certain characters, because it's rather wonky. Like I tried this with Shenhe and it's a little bit weird. I feel like I get stuck into an animation a bit too long. The damage is definitely decent, but it just feels very awkward to play. Now, Noelle Plunge on the other hand is a very funny team, but it actually works, and in fact I would say it actually works better than her conventional team. Now keep in mind that my Noelle is not optimal. Like my stats are like 78 crit rate with like 100 something crit damage because I've been kind of lazy to farm the Husk domain. I've been building so much characters, and yet with Furina, Xinyan, and I think I was running Goro in the footage, she's still able to do 60k plunge on average, and she is able to do it really fast. And it makes the team even better that if you have to run Noelle with Furina, she's a healer, right? So if you have C1, every plunge you do, every hit you do is going to basically trigger a healing prop for the entire team, and you're going to build fanfare stacks way faster than you would be able to do normally, so that's pretty good. As you can see in the footage right now, if Noelle actually triggers the collision of the enemy, she could actually do a total of 80k plunge within a matter of like less than a second. So that's actually pretty insane. However, the downside of this team is that Noelle very much needs Favonius because she is very energy hungry despite having a 60 burst cost. And I would say the only two solutions I found is that either you run Favonius on your Noelle, you'll lose a little bit of damage, but it should be fine because you're able to maintain her burst out time and help battery the entire team, or you run basically Favonius on your teammates like Furina, Favonius, or Shenyun and Goro, then maybe you'll be able to barely battery Noelle in a perfect rotation. So for Pyros only, I didn't actually test it. I've watched Mr. Zajev77 do it. I don't really need to say much about this team. To be honest, it just works. Like, I forgot to mention this, but speaking of Xiao, I actually tested Xiao Vape, and unironically, I think it's actually about as good as a C6 Faruzan team. So for any Xiao mains who don't have a C6 Faruzan, but you happen to have like C6 Bennett and a Shenyun, you could try this out. Needless to say, it's able to compete with a Hyper-Carry Xiao. What a world we live in. And for the last team, the unexpected one, Cyno Plunge, which, funny enough, I don't know, maybe my Cyno is not that great, or maybe like I haven't tested this properly, but I think I did. This team is unironically better than a regular Hyper Bloom team. Essentially, the team has Nahida for the Dendro app, and I believe Shenyun and Furina, so you can kind of trigger like a little bit of Hyper Bloom and a little bit of Aggravate from a little bit of both. And since my Cyno does have a Thundering Fury set, right, you don't actually have to restrict yourself to basically doing only plunging attacks. You could basically use like skill into burst, and then you could use a skill and then you trigger a plunging attack, and then like if Thundering Fury triggers, then maybe you could do like 1 or 2 skills. I usually trigger the skill at the Eye of Judgment every 2 plunges, and surprisingly it clears very well, and I was actually quite shocked to see how well this team actually does. And unironically, I actually started liking Cyno again ever since I tried this team, so that's what you call a miracle. I don't understand why this works, but it works. And lastly, I know some people would ask about this, but Raiden Plunge is a thing. However, she does not benefit from Shenyun's Ascension 4 for the flat damage buff. Like, even though Xianyun allows her to do the plunging attacks from her burst, she doesn't actually buff Raiden's plunging attack, and I think this is very likely due to how Hoyo coded Raiden's burst, because as some may know, Raiden's burst, any hit that she does can trigger things like Xingqiu or Yelan, right? But it doesn't actually work with Beido's burst. I think very likely it's related to how they coded her elemental burst as a burst type so that it can work with the likes of the 4 emblem of Severed Fate. Now, in terms of other teams, I couldn't really test some of the characters that I don't have, like Neuvillette or Raisli, but I have seen a few videos and I've watched a few gameplays here and there, and I can say that both are pretty good. To be honest, Xianyun just allows all these teams to just work in the form of plunging attack. Now, let's close things off. To summarize it, is she really a good unit? I would say that's very much situational. And is Xianyun worth pulling for? Honestly, it really depends on whether you like her character or or you like the whole plunging attack playstyle, since that is essentially her whole theme. I do like the fact that she works really well with Furina, so even if you were to pull her as some sort of like gene upgrade, she definitely opens up quite a lot of variety in what teams you play just by allowing anyone in the game to become Xiao. For my past week of basically enjoying time with playing Genshin Impact, I've been having a blast trying out different teams, testing out different wacky things that I would never have considered tried before. But I think at the end of the day, right, it's really just up to personal preference. So if you do like plunging attacks, if you do like Xianyun as a character, you could probably go for it. But if you don't really go for her, I don't think you're really missing all that much. It depends on what your priorities are. Anyways, that's the end of the video. Give it a like if you enjoyed it and you found this video to be informational. Hit that subscribe button if you'd like to see more content like this on my channel. And leave a comment down below on what you personally think of Xianyun or how Xinyan has been treating for your account. I've been Ethereal, that is it for now, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out.